Welcome to the Martinus Cosmology podcast, our podcast for talks and reflections on life seen from the perspective of the Danish writer Martinus and his spiritual works. My name is Pernilla Rosell, and I will be your host for today. I'm sitting here in Stockholm in January 2019, together with a very dear friend who's visiting our podcast for the first time, Anne Pullar. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
So happy to have you here today. And those of you who have visited the Martinus Center in Klint in Denmark, or our own little center in Stockholm, obviously know you already. You have given lectures in Martinus's cosmology for many years and also translated Martinus for many years in writing. You're the editor, together with your partner, for the English edition of the magazine Cosmos, and you also translate every summer, don't you?
Yes.
So I think your voice will be very familiar to anyone who's been to Klint and who wants to listen to the English translation. Today we're going to talk about a very important and serious topic that actually concerns everyone, all human beings and other beings, and that is death and what happens after death, according to Martinus. So we'll come back to that, but just to begin with, I would like to ask you, could you tell us something about your background and how you encountered Martinus's works?
Yes, I can start with how I came into contact with Martinus. In my late teens, I was very bothered about suffering, the meaning of suffering. I was working in a hospital, in a ward where people were very ill, and they either died or ended up in mental hospitals. And it made a deep impression on me. And I had been sort of religious, and I really wanted that to be a god or a meaning with life, but I saw things in society and around me. I thought it looked as if the world was going up the creek. So I was angry with God, if there was a God. So I was really in this theodicy problem. I don't quite know how to say it in English. So I kicked out God, but I also missed God. But it made me into a seeker, and I looked into anthroposophy and theosophy. Parallel with that, I studied philosophy at the university, which I found very interesting, and I liked many of especially the early philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and Leibniz and Hegel. But the studying there was very detached to one's personal view or questions. We never went into that. So I left there after some years. And during this period, I was more or less atheist. But I went on studying biology and actually became religious over the microscope.
Over the microscope?
Yes.
That seems quite unusual, perhaps.
Well, I saw such beauty and such structure and such planning, and it was just amazing if you look at a little pollen or a seed or something, or a stem, section of a stem of a flower, or a cell, an animal cell, and how the physiology is organized is just absolutely mind-blowing. And to consider that as being coincidence, as they do, if I express myself like that, seemed just ridiculous. So I sort of felt that there must be a meaning, there must be something behind matter that creates this beauty. It must be an act of creation. I mean, I was not really formulating it, but I was asking questions to my lecturers, but they didn't understand my questions, I'm afraid. But anyhow, in that period, I also found a little ad in a magazine about therapy, that there was an introductory lecture on Martinus cosmology. And for some reason, I went. And there I, for the first time, encountered an explanation to the meaning of suffering, darkness, and that it had a purpose, and that the purpose is loving. So I was very moved and taken by this, and I felt that I found home. And since then I've stayed there. And I began to study Martinus, but I'm a slow reader, and I found it rather difficult in the beginning. So I went to courses and lectures, and then it has grown slowly but surely. And it might sound a bit ridiculous, but I feel as if it saved my life, because I was really miserable before I found these explanations.
I think it's beautiful. I don't think it's ridiculous at all, and I think many people experience that or have similar experiences, either when they, as we have done, encounter Martinus and find great inspiration in his works, or anything else that actually helps them with spiritual support. It could be your own crisis, or it could be, as you said, the suffering in the world that you just can't cope with it.
Yeah.
I think that's something that many people share. And perhaps then that's a natural transition to our topic for today, because if we do talk about suffering, the experience of losing someone through death, or the fear of dying yourself, might be perhaps one of the greatest things that we don't understand in life, a great mystery, at least in our time in Scandinavia, where many people are atheists. And it's very difficult for us to explain death. It's something that we don't talk about. It's a taboo subject, I think, in many parts of the world, but perhaps especially in our very materialistic atheist society, where we don't even have any place for suffering, pain, illness, and death. And we want to live as long as possible. Many people count on having one life only, so of course they don't want to think about death. But we know that we all die, don't we? So could you tell us briefly, it's difficult to summarize it, but what does Martinus say about death? What kind of comfort could we find in his words?
Well, in my experience, there's lots of comfort in what he writes about death. Very, very comforting. And one of the things he points out is that, he says, death does not exist other than as our belief in death. And he says for a materialistically orientated person who's an atheist, it's life's biggest surprise. And he also says that he describes there are many different ways of experiencing death, depending on lots of different things that we can go into a little bit later. And if we die old and not in pain, he says that it's like a sunset in the physical world and a sunrise in the spiritual world. And he also says that the fear of death is the root of all our fears. So to the degree that we can be more comfortable with the idea of dying and death, we should be able to be less fearful of life, which I think is a rather attractive idea. And I think it's as you mentioned earlier, this business of losing what we experience that we have, things that we hold on to, close relationships, and can be afraid of losing one's job or losing money and all kinds of things. But the more familiar we become with the idea of that we are eternal beings, our life experience never ceases. We've always existed and had life experience, and we will always have it. That's quite mind-blowing, I find. And I forget it every day.
Yeah, because of course we do feel quite physical. At least I do, in the physical world. We are sitting right now and talking to each other, and we can see our physical bodies and the table and the microphones and the cables recording this podcast. But of course he tells us that we are in reality always spiritual beings. This is just some kind of, what do they call it in computer games? avatar that we use in order to manifest ourselves, and then we will just go on using another body, since he actually tells us we have several bodies that we can use. But of course we perhaps tend to forget it. Our physical world seems so real, and when somebody dies, they certainly don't look alive, and we can't talk to them, and we might miss them a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It's certainly not. I believe that for me it is a help in the situation of losing somebody, but it's certainly painful anyhow.
But it tells us that we are in reality spiritual beings. So we are two spirits watching, having a conversation right now, aren't we?
And that our bodies are tools of manifesting in the spiritual, in the physical world, but that we are primarily spiritual beings on a journey where we have these experiences in the physical world in order to learn. I'm thinking of what concepts we need from the Martinus world picture in order to make the other things we're going to talk about seem logical. Because that's what is for me, the greatest strength in Martinus cosmology and world picture, is that it makes things hang together in a way that I haven't found anywhere else to that extent.
Yes, certainly if you compare it perhaps to traditional Christianity, which is not that strange to me. I certainly can recognize myself having been in a Christian context, perhaps in earlier lives. But then you see our physical life as a sort of long road, or perhaps a short road of suffering. And it's just something that you need to endure, and then you will finally get to paradise if you believe in Jesus Christ and God strongly enough, and if you haven't been too bad. So, I mean, that would be the explanation, but there is no real logic behind human beings being on earth at all. And no reason for suffering in that sense. And in Martinus, it's quite different, isn't it? We see, why do we need to be on earth? What do we learn here?
Well, one can say that he says that life on earth is a school, a long education, and we die and we have a holiday in the spiritual world, and then we come back and we have a new year at school, or a lifetime at school, and then we have a rest again. And sometimes we have shorter periods in our physical life, and sometimes we have long ones. And that we're really all on a journey through the spiral cycle, which is one of a way of measuring eternity, one could say, where all living beings are on a journey through one spiral cycle after the other, but they are gigantic, and we as living beings come from eons of time in spiritual worlds. We go into matter again as mineral beings without any outer consciousness, and then we slowly evolve into the plant kingdom, where we begin to develop physical senses. Flowers and plants, they react to light and to water and to warmth and so on, and they become more and more physical and slowly evolve into the animal kingdom, becoming more and more physical. If you look at a carnivore, a lion or a tiger, their senses are extremely sharp in the physical world, and their bodies work fantastically well physically. And we go into the killing principle and struggle for survival and so on, and eventually develop into the second part of the animal kingdom, where we find terrestrial human being today, where we are becoming satiated of the killing and being animal, and we long for peace and friendship and are making experiences that will help us or get us through to becoming more spiritual again. And eventually we don't need this school of life. We've learned how the laws of life work, and we will become spiritual beings for eons of time until we get satiated of that. And the suffering is really only a 12th of this cycle. That I find comforting.
So it is for a limited period of time, and there is a purpose to it.
Yes.
That is what it tells us. But perhaps somebody who is new to Martinus's world picture would still ask, why do we have to die at all? Or why do we have to leave our physical body? Couldn't we just have one body and just heal like they do in some computer games and just go on learning things?
Well, as life is development, and it is really development of our consciousness, not the body is a tool for the consciousness. Our bodies need to be exchanged, because through one lifetime our consciousness develops, and we sort of grow out of the kind of body we have. And the next time we come back, we'll have a body that is more suited for our consciousness. And also we at the moment we're not very good at taking care of our bodies, so we often die with rather decrepit bodies and in illness and so on. So in that circumstances, it's a relief to be freed of a body that is just painful, and actually have a rest from it, and the next time actually create a healthy body, as we do when we grow up, when we're born in the next lifetime.
We could certainly imagine that having to live on with the same old sick body would perhaps really be hell on earth. And we can see that some old people actually perhaps long for being relieved of their bodies and having this holiday that Martinus actually says that we do have after death. So perhaps we should go on to that question. We can find comfort in the fact that he tells us that we don't die. It will be a great and very pleasant surprise. But what happens? What actually happens when we die, according to Martinus? I mean, we know that many people have had near-death experiences from all over the world, and they do tell different stories. There are some similar traits. Very many people see a light and perhaps feel a lot of warmth and joy and comfort, but there are also many differences. What does Martinus say? What happens when we die?
Well, it is rather different depending on the situation. If you die as a child, he says it's rather easy, and we are, because we don't think so much, we don't have a bad conscience, and if we've experienced children being in pain, we know that being ill, they sort of, they are ill, but they don't think so much of it, and they cry when it hurts, and when it doesn't hurt, it's over. And so that transition is easier, and they ask for help if they need it on the other side. That's a sort of instinct we have with us. If we die, I think maybe we can start by talking about that. The main thing to understand, and that is I find very helpful, is that when we leave our physical body, we have, according to Martinus, 5 other bodies, and our consciousness moves from being attached to our physical body to what he calls our body of feeling. And what happens then is that our world of thought, that when we are physical, is sort of in our head sort of thing, that becomes our surroundings. And we follow our beliefs and our expectations. So if we are deeply religious, and as you mentioned, feel we have been a good enough human being and believe in Christ and God, then our transition will follow those ideas. But if we believe that we've been very bad Christians and are afraid of hell, then we can actually experience hell as we pass over, until we ask for help or cry out for help. Because the world that we go into is full of spiritual helpers. But as long as we are not asking for help, they can't help us. So, and what might also be difficult is if we are materialistically orientated and atheist, and when we've committed suicide because we were very depressed and lonely, or failed and considered ourselves as failures, then we commit suicide in order to be freed of this, or be freed of this experience. But what happens then is that when we've killed our body, we are still there, and our misery has become our outer world, and we will find ourselves in a dark place, maybe together with other souls that have taken their lives, until we ask for help. And when we ask for help, there are spiritual beings that take care of us. And Martinus describes these things very, very beautifully. There's so much love and also kind of simplicity as he describes it. There'll be a being who says, well, this is not a physical world. Here is a world of thought. Look, now I'm imagining, thinking of a blue sky and a garden of flowers, and there it is. And now you try. Think of a small, beautiful thing, a small flower, and then the flower will be there. So, yeah, that's the initial stage. It might also be that we are met by relatives that have passed over before us, and there might be a welcome party, if that's what we are expecting. So we are well taken care of. And when I've been studying this, I've sometimes had the thought, I would like to be able to bring a piece of paper or have written in my hand, but I won't have a hand to write in, where it says, ask for help.
Exactly. I was going to say the same thing. I always think I must remember to ask for help. I don't know how to remember it. Of course, the more we practice these thoughts during our life, during our physical life, perhaps the easier it will be, because we actually practice a new talent. But then we have all those primitive sides. Of course, it takes time. Martinus often tells us that we need to have patience, and it takes time. And we have those primitive sides when we die. And some of them perhaps we don't want to recognize at all. And what happens to all our primitive sides when we meet all those relatives and so on?
Well, that's another piece of good news.
Yeah.
we are helped to get rid of them temporarily. He describes this process in slightly different ways in different places, so it's not quite easy to know what he means. Sometimes he says that our primitive and selfish sides and fears and so on, that they are go into a state of paralysis. Other places he says that these spiritual beings and helpers, they use suggestion to gradually sort of quieten down or make this part of us unconscious. But he also describes it as something that we actually get rid of temporarily. Thought is really mineral matter, and so it also sometimes sounds like this is a kind of spiritual surgery, where what we sometimes can experience from the physical point of view as ghosts is or can be the leftovers of this spiritual body that is no longer connected to a living being. It's just a sort of shadow. and that can last for some 100 years, but it actually dissolves eventually.
So that means that if you meet somebody you love here on earth, or somebody that you like very much, you would have the same feeling when you meet that person again. But if you meet perhaps a neighbor that you didn't like at all, or anyone that you just couldn't put up with, you would love that person too.
Yes, we don't remember anybody as an enemy.
And that person would love you back, so it would of course be similar.
Yes.
So it would really be a great feast of love then.
Yeah, and when we've been he calls this intermediate stage a changing room, where we take off our physical stuff, and when we've got rid of, or been helped to get rid of our negative aspects, then we all go into the paradise, experience of paradise that is perfect for each one of us. And they can be very different. Everything that we've been longing for during our physical lifetime and we have not managed to fulfill, such as if you're working as an architect all your life, very ambitious, but I mean, you need money and you need building material and you need employees and what have you, and maybe you have dreams of what you would like to build, but it's been impossible. But when you then are in the spiritual world here, you'll be able to build everything that you've dreamt of. And if you're a musician, you'll be able to stand on stage and do the most perfect performances, and the audience will be praising you. And if you've been poor and cold and had a miserable life, longing for a safe home and to have plenty of food, then you'll experience that. And also, depending upon, we've also been, and there still are beings on earth that are in the stage of having a Viking morality, so to say, where the highest joy is to kill, and that you're considered a hero only if you die by being killed. There's a paradise also for that person, because and nobody's really killed because it's all in our imagination. So we all have our own paradise, and we repeat it over and over again until we are satiated. It becomes a cliche and we become tired of it. And if we have been very interested in helping others, and that is our greatest desire, then we can also be guardian angels, so to say, for people who are still on earth, or people who are in the intermediate zone and need help. Yeah, that's a few examples.
And it's quite beautiful too. It strikes me also that we really see how God doesn't distinguish between the different beings, human beings or even animals, but different human beings at different stages, as you say. Everybody gets the paradise. We are used to evaluate people, and we are longing for humanity. So of course we have difficulties in accepting the Viking morality, as you said. But in paradise, after death, everybody's equal. Everybody gets their individual paradise. It is quite moving in a way.
Yes, it is. One becomes more clear over, as you said, how much we evaluate.
Yeah.
And that in relation to God, we are loved whoever we are and wherever we are. And we all go through the same or similar type of stages. If we long for, if we are really humane and long for peace and brotherhood and so on, that's because we've been through suffering, and because we have been Vikings and we have been maybe, robbers and murderers, and that we all have tried killing ourselves. And
exactly. He says that we all need to go through that as well, and then realize that it was a mistake.
Yeah.
Also, of course, considering that our body consists of living beings. We have talked about that in other podcasts. So when somebody is in such a state of despair that you can't see any other way than killing yourself, you actually kill a lot of other beings as well. But Martinus never judges, it just tells us what reality is like, and that life always goes on. But what happens then to our dark thoughts and primitive sides? I temporarily love the neighbor that I used to hate, but I mean, it doesn't last forever, does it?
No.
That would be too easy.
He describes that when we then been through, he describes that we also visit depending on our degree of neighborly love and how developed our spirit is, we visit the spiritual worlds. So if we are humanely developed engineers, for instance, we'll be able to visit what Martinus calls the kingdom of wisdom, where there's God's workshop, where beings who are at home there, who are there in their stage in the spiral cycle, where they are planning new worlds and new types of living beings and constructions. We can have a look into that and find all the inspiration we need, and we sort of charge our life batteries, and eventually we really long to go back into a new incarnation. We all go through what he calls the kingdom of bliss, where we go into our own memory of previous incarnations, 3 or possibly 4 incarnations, where we really sort of re-experience what we've been through as gold copies, where we see the meaning and the love and everything we've experienced. And this really fills us with the wish to be born again and to continue learning, to continue our journey of developing our consciousness, become more loving, and work with these negative aspects, animal aspects that we still have, once again. And so on. Then we have another lifetime, and then we have another holiday and another lifetime until we're fully educated in love.
And I think it also makes sense in so many ways that when you talk about this initial, almost physical paradise that we all experience adapted to our individual wishes and longings, but when that goes on forever, and forever it might be slightly boring even. So of course we realize that when we get satiated, we go on, we move on, as you say, through these spiritual worlds according to our possibility of experience anything in them, and then we are born again. So reincarnation, we come back to that. Without the thought of reincarnation, it's really impossible to understand Martinus's world picture, I would say.
Yeah, in one way, if I go back, I remember thinking that that is not really having one life. It's just as strange in a way as having several. And since we come into life and have experienced such richness, our world of thought, our world of feeling, our relationships, well, there are actually a lot of things that become more reasonable thinking of when you put reincarnation into the picture. But that's another podcast.
Yeah, I think we'll do that. I can also actually refer to an earlier podcast called Our Eternal Core of Being, where Mary McGovern and Søren Grind talk more about Martinus' spiral cycles and the whole analysis of the eye and so on, because we can't really go into all those details now, but we can recommend that if you want to repeat his overall description of the spiral cycle. But Martinus talks a lot about cycles, doesn't he? That everything moves in cycles. So how can we understand his description of death, seen from that perspective, that everything moves in cycles?
Well, if we look at a lifetime, it has different stages. We we are born and we are young and we develop and we could reach maturity and we have a lot of life experience, and then our body will become old, and that represents the stages of a cycle that always has a beginning, an intermediate stage, a culmination, and then another intermediate stage. And death is then, well, it depends how you look at it, but it's really just a transition into, well, a larger cycle.
Absolutely. And that sort of no movement can actually take place in isolation. It's always part of a cycle. We don't see the whole cycle. We can see a day's cycle, the cycle of the day, or the cycle of the year. It's quite dark right now in January in Stockholm. So we are aware of that.
Yeah, and everything in nature and everything in our physiology moves in cycles.
Yeah, I can notice the grey hair that one gets when one gets older.
But when you study biology, you see this principle all the time, and cycles that work together in various ways. And I mean, it's becoming more mainstream to think in cycles, recycling and respect the cycles of nature and try to work with them rather than against them. But that's from the physical point of view. But when you bring the spiritual world into the principle of cycles, and then there are many, many more cycles. I mean, we've got the cycle between the physical world or physical lifetime and the spiritual lifetime, spiritual holiday or lifetime. And Martinus actually describes that he calls sleep the little or the small death. Because when we sleep, our consciousness more or less, to a certain degree, leaves our body, and we visit the spiritual world or the four courts of it, and are relieved of, and especially being physical is rather tiresome. Our nervous system especially gets worn out during the day, and that's what we experience as tiredness. And so we fall asleep. And our mind, our thoughts, don't sleep, but they just go somewhere else. And when we wake up, and while we're sleeping, the nervous system and our body is restored. There's lots of science on research done on that now, where one is becoming much more clear over how rejuvenating sleep, a good night's sleep is. And when we wake up after a good night's sleep, we do feel refreshed, and often we can have a much more positive perspective on the problems that we have in our lives in the morning than we have when we are tired in the evening. And that can also, I mean, there are quite many examples in history how scientists who are working with a problem wake up the next morning and have the solution. So where did the solution come from? Maybe they have been conferring with a spiritual colleague while they were asleep and had a suggestion or information of how to solve it. So we have this cycle of being physical in the daytime and spiritual in the nighttime also there. And then there's the cycle of the spiral cycle, where we have a physical part and a spiritual part.
Exactly, and as you said, people actually start discovering, for example, how important sleep is. I think Mary McCoven, who is on the Martinus Cosmology podcast team, actually plans to record an episode dedicated to sleep and what Martinus tells us about sleep. Hoping for that. But as you said, actually in science, people start discovering how important, we could perhaps call it, our spiritual life is for our well-being. And that we really need a good night's sleep in order to be healthy. But of course, many people, it's not accepted by traditional science, but we can see those near-death experiences actually almost explode right now, I think. You hear more and more narratives. I mean, the most famous perhaps are books by, for example, Ibn Alexander, the neurosurgeon, or Anita Moorjani is very well known. And we have, even in the Martinus Institute, listened to the cardiologist Pim van Lommel from the Netherlands, who told us about his own experience as a doctor. People waking up and telling him that they were quite disappointed actually to be back. And so on. So we see this everywhere. What do you think? Do you think that we are watching a change in people's attitudes?
Yes, I do. And I mean, there's more and more information and science or collected structure. Just as Pim van Lommel has written a book in a scientific way, even if a materialistically orientated scientist would not consider it as science, but it's very structured.
Yeah.
And this corresponds to that there's more and more information available, and it's very accessible. There's masses of YouTube clips about NDE and how life transforming this experience has been for people, and meeting what they call often the unconditional love. And I remember Anita Moorjani, I mean, this experience changed her a lot. She says that she was a very fearful person before this experience, and afterwards she's very safe. She experienced that her fears had disappeared. So, yes, there must be a change coming. How fast? I don't know. But I can also see it that the young people growing up now, in a way, all this internet and computer games and so on they are more in their thought and imagination than I was when I grew up. And in these computer games, you have one life after the other. And so I think that is a kind of preparation for it will be easier for them to shift. And mobile phones, I mean, what are they? You can compare them to our physical body. You have to have internet. You have to have wavelengths in the phone for it to work. And it's the same with us, really. There has to have to be a spirit that is a wavelength or a bunch of waves in order for our body to work. And it's actually the spirit manifesting through the body.
Our consciousness, that is actually everything. Yeah. Exactly. I think you're right. And it will be very exciting to follow the development and see how those people who are young today and who grew up with these self-evident thoughts of just being able to transmit their thoughts everywhere and also to create a lot in the computer world and in other ways as well. And they don't seem to need all those physical things that the older generation needed. So they don't need all that furniture, all those big houses and so on. At least that's what it seems. They are more interested in taking care of the environment and following that cycle that you talked about. So in that way, it's quite hopeful. But of course, still, I read in a newspaper article, I think it was the Telegraph, that at least 37% of the British people, it was a British newspaper, over 40 have never made any preparations for their death, have never talked about it, have never planned their death. So we still might come back to this concept of death or impending death, whatever, as being a kind of a taboo subject for many people. And now we have talked about here that we find a lot of comfort in Martinus's analyses. But does that mean, if I might ask a very personal question before we wrap it up for today, what about ourselves in real life? Not in theory, but in practice. Are you afraid of death?
difficult to know how I will react. But I mean, I'm not looking forward to having pain and struggle, certainly not. I do believe that having studied Martinus is going to help me, and it's making me less afraid. But I think I'm very vulnerable in relation to losing somebody close. If my partner dies before me, that's going to be very difficult. I will sort of feel, what about me? When I've experienced following two persons dying, one was my father and one was a close friend my own age, and I found the analysis, Martinus world picture, very, very helpful in those situations, knowing that this person would be well taken care of. And I also felt sort of relieved of the responsibility of caring, that now they would be in good hands. But the emptiness and the sorrow still there for a long time. But also thinking that they're not really far away. If I contact this friend of mine, for instance, in my mind, and imagine this person being in his paradise, that feels very comforting, and I can sort of sense a kind of, I don't know if it is contact, if it is imaginative, my imagination or not, but that doesn't matter. But yeah, I don't know.
I think it's difficult to be so sure about how I will react and feel when that day comes, certainly. And I would think, talking here to you, I feel sort of very uplifted and think I wouldn't be afraid of my own death, but I don't know what it would be like when you're in absolutely no control of what's happening. And as you say, I would be at the time, much more afraid of losing somebody, and I wouldn't like to die before my children are really grown up and so on. I've often thought about that, and I guess we have experienced leaving children behind, and that might have been a special kind of anguish. But right now, I think I would find it very difficult to cope with losing somebody, and that I feel at least a little nervous, but not really, really scared about dying myself. And as you said, you could be afraid of pain and so on. So, I mean, we are just human. But it's important to talk about it, I think, perhaps more than we do today. And Martinus gives us great, as we said, he comforts us, but he also gives us he supports us so that we can talk about this subject when he tells us, don't be afraid, it will be a great surprise. And he gives us all that logic underpinning his analyses as well, which we need. So we could go on talking about this a long time, but I think it's really time to wrap it up. And we thought when we planned this podcast that it would be nice to listen to Martinus's own words. His works are so full of logic everywhere, but they are also full of poetry, I think, and they are beautiful. So he really combines beauty with logic. And in one of the small books called The Road to Paradise, we have a beautiful passage about what it's like when we die, when we are tired and when we need rest, and we long for finding a place to rest.
It's written as a metaphor.
Exactly. So if you could perhaps read that to us.
Yeah. There is no living being whatsoever in the physical universe that is not on his road leading to the divine abode of all living beings. This road of life is immeasurably long, but we have seen that the tired wanderer who has to negotiate it is well taken care of. Here there are many inns built in the same joyful and happy style as the Father's house or God's own paradise, which is the goal for all travelers who travel this divine road. Here the hard-pressed, wandering Son of God can spend the night, have a good rest, and enjoy the entire bodily warmth and well-being of fatherly love. Here he can have his worn-out and decrepit physical means of transport replaced, and even get a completely new traveling kit, so that, refreshed and with new zest for life, he again set out on a new lap to the next inn, and so on in this way from inn to inn on the long journey towards the great revelation of the adventure of life, or the solution to the mystery of life, or the riddle of the universe.
So that's quite wonderful, isn't it? And to realize we are all travelers, cosmic travelers on this long journey.
Yes.
I would like to thank you so much, Anne, for joining me for this podcast.
Thank you.
And goodbye from Stockholm.